Anyway, so there's something to be said for people, places, and things that have imperfections in them. And on that note, there's a certain archetype that I've noticed in I was going to say fiction, but it's not just fiction because, there's a certain archetype in stories, both real and imagined, of people leaving a supposedly perfect place for an imperfect place. And perhaps one of the most famous examples, maybe one of the most significant examples to our human history, was that of Buddha, who used to be, for those who don't, whether you know the history of Buddha or not, I'll just reiterate a little bit. Before he was the Buddha, he was just a guy named Siddhartha, and I believe he was a prince. Forgive me, my grasp of history is terrible, but my understanding was that Siddhartha was a prince, and he sort of lived in this idyllic princely existence where he wasn't really aware of what was going on in the world. And his father kind of tried to hide from him the harsh realities of life, the existence of poor or hungry or destitute people. But one day, the prince saw an elderly poor man, and he determined that he must know more. He determined that he must understand more of the plight of people who were not fortunate and rich. And so he sort of cast off this perfect princely life that he had been born into, and again determined that he would learn more about the flawed elements of human reality. And I say this is an archetype because I've heard the same idea from a couple of other stories. There's also a book which I'm kind of reading right now. It's called Rasselas, and I think the subtitle is The History of the Prince of Abyssinia or something like that. It's a fictional book written by Samuel Johnson. It's really the only real kind of novel that Samuel Johnson wrote. He wrote, I think, a lot of poetry and nonfiction and stuff like that, but I think this is the only novel that he wrote with his life. And Samuel Johnson was a very distinguished man. He was... I think he was called perhaps the most distinguished man of letters in British society or something like that. So I'm enjoying actually the novel Rasselas very much. It's not really a novel. You couldn't call it a novel. It's hardly a piece of fiction. It's more like a philosophical treatise that just happens to be couched in a story setting. But then the same is true of Neil Stephenson's Anathema, which is probably my favorite book that I've ever read. So, I guess I don't really like just stories for the sake of stories. I enjoy this sort of philosophical meandering within a fictional setting. But anyway, the book sort of has the same idea. It starts off with this prince being in the happy valley, where everything is perfect and life is great and everybody is just happy and laughing all the time, but he's miserable and he wants to get out and see the real world with all its imperfections. Shortly after I had come here to Russia, I mentioned this idea to one of my coworkers, and I said, there's a certain archetype of people leaving these perfect places and going to imperfect places because they want to see the real world. They want to see life as it really is and not allow themselves to be constrained by these artfully sort of constructed false realities that suggest that life is without struggle. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I came to Russia. To sort of see a side of the world that I had never seen before. And my coworker said to me, in this respect, in this sort of idea of leaving these idyllic, perfect places for flawed worlds, you live up to your namesake. In real life, my real name is Adam, and I came from a religious family. I was in fact named after the biblical Adam, so it's not just a coincidence. Oh, I don't think my parents named me with the idea that I would be cast out of any literal or figurative Garden of Eden, but you get the idea. I mean, you understand the analogy. I hope, if you know the biblical story of Adam, how he was cast out of the Garden of Eden. There's this sort. It was sort of a funny and astute observation, I would say, by my coworker, because I'd never really thought of that connection before, but it was an interesting thing to say. Anyway.